Unit 20. Hello everybody, this is Unit 24, Analysis of Perception chapter in Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, Part 1, paragraph 111 to paragraph 112. Some characteristics of Hegel's Phenomenology and the Perception chapter of it. Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind deals with the problem of knowledge. Fidelity said various forms of knowledge which cover from the most primitive form of it, that is essential certainty, to the highest form, that is the absolute knowledge. The section consciousness refers to the object-oriented knowledge, that is something like common sense, whereas the section self-consciousness discussed the subject-oriented knowledge, that is something like anthropology and psychology. The section consciousness consists of three subsections: sensual certainty, perception, and force and understanding. These three titles refer respectively to the shape of knowledge, which Hegel calls the appearing knowledge, thus erscheinende Wissen in German. Each appearing knowledge has its own cognitive intention and the certainty of its cognition. However, the initial certainty of each cognitive shape turns out to be false. Therefore, at the end of every knowledge process, the initial scheme of the knowledge changes into another shape of knowledge. Thus, Hegel's phenomenology of mind might be thought of as a psychology of the cognitive development. The perception chapter in Hegel's phenomenology of mind, Fidelity said, the second perception, hereafter simply perception, is enormously difficult and complicated to understand. Therefore, until now, the correct analysis of it has not been made. First of all, perception is made up of two tightly related but different parts. The first part, paragraph 111 to paragraph 122, deals with the problematic of a substance or thing and its property, which was provoked by English empiricism. However, the second part, paragraph 123 to 131, mainly deals with the problematic of a substance and modification by Spinoza. These two, correlatively entangled by distinctive problems about the substance notion, are surveyed together in the same chapter. In the first part of perception, the appearing knowledge intends to grasp the universal, that is, the universal contrary to the individual or the particular. Perception seeks to grasp the universal. However, the universal which Hegel referred to is actually the problem of a matter and its properties, or substance and its attributes, which was critically investigated by English empiricism. John Locke, for example, thought of the substance as a something I know not what. Hegel's attitude is also not so different from the empiricism. The common notion of a substance and its property is not to be accepted. In the perception chapter, the matter is synonymous with the thing, the object, and the substance. Moreover, the property, Eigenschaft in German, is exchangeable with the attribute. In the foregoing chapter, that is essential certainty, the mind, that is the knowledge-seeking mind, tries to capture the individual. For example, this tree or this house. However, the arrived knowledge was the universal knowledge, that is the notion of the tree or the house. The meaning of the statement, this is my house, is obvious, but the truth value of the statement is not in itself determined. It depends on the circumstance. Knowledge is essentially knowledge of the universal. Therefore, the knowledge is different from the information as temporarily cognizance. For example, it is 2:40 p.m. Second chapter, Hegel's perception and the category of a substance property in the modern philosophy. The perception as a type of cognition has nothing to do with the sensation or the perception in the usual meaning. It is a kind of intelligence, so to speak, a lowly intelligence which will grasp the relation of object and the property. Therefore, perception is a common belief on the subject, matter and property, which is, however, to be analyzed and criticized in the philosophical perspective. Hegel seemed to employ the German word wahrnehmen, that is, wahr is true, nehmen is taking, receiving, in order to express the knowledge of the truth. In this regard, the perception as a wahrnehmen refers to the cognition of the substantiality and relation of a substance and attribute. Before we are going to analyze Hegel's thought about the substantiality, we had better drop by the foregoing philosopher on that theme. A short history of a substance in the modern philosophy from Descartes to Kant. The relation of the substance and attribute or object and property was a very important issue of modern philosophy. Therefore, the philosophers at that time often dealt with that problem. By Descartes, there are three kinds of beings: substance, attribute, and mode. These three are in relation of dependence. Mode depends on attribute, and attribute depends on substances, which subsist for itself. There is said to be plural substances by Descartes. In addition, Descartes came up with the principal attribute or property that makes the substance be known by us. Therefore, the principal attribute is the same as the essence in traditional term. The nature of mind is by Descartes to think, therefore the mind is a thinking substance, and to think is the mind's principal attribute. In contrast with the plural substance by Descartes, Spinoza reduced the number of the substance into one. There is only one substance which exists in itself, that is God. God is the only substance. His notion of a mode or modification is to be taken notice of. Modification exists in something external to themselves. As will be afterwards described, this conception of the modification by Spinoza played a critical role in Hegel's concept of being for other. For by substance would be understood that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, that is something of which the conception requires not the conception of anything else. Whereas modification exists in something external to themselves, and the conception of them is formed by means of a conception of the thing in which they exist. The Ethics by Spinoza. Contrary to the rationalistic employment of the notion of a substance, British empiricism declined to accept the traditional concept of a substance. Locke began to put the notion of a substance into question. He characterized the substance which is supposed to underlie the properties of a thing as something I know not what. Berkeley took the next step, deny that the notion of a substance has any meaning at all, and that in that way eliminated the material substance altogether. Then Hume eliminated both mental and the material substance. According to Hume, mankind is only a bundle of perceptions. With English empiricism, philosophy and science lost their foundation because of its denial of the notion of the substance. According to Aristotle, the starting point of all science is indeed the notion of the substance. After the desperation of the human knowledge through British empiricism, for the first time Rousseau opened the possibility of science and knowledge when he combined the active thinking I with the given sensuous material. Immanuel Kant, as the successor of the Rousseau, developed the sprout of the combination of reason and sensation by Rousseau more deliberately to attain the great synthesis of empiricism and rationalism. According to Kant, the category of substance, like other categories of the understanding, does not belong to the matter or sensation, but to the mind, the understanding. Through the participation of the category in the sensation or the matter, human knowledge wins actually the objectivity reality. Kant's successor Fichte wanted to relate all the categories of human understanding directly to the active function of the ego, I, which means fundamental return to the Descartes principle. Fichte's solution of substance is that substance turns into attributes when the former is analyzed, and the attributes turn into substance when the former is synthesized. There is no need to think about the substance as the bearer of the attributes. Moreover, the notion of substance and attributes can be deduced from the activity of the ego. In this respect, Fichte influenced most strongly Hegel's thought of substance. Hegel's philosophical thought about the substance owed Fichte's fundamental principle of the whole science of knowledge, Grundlage der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre in German, 1794. Hereafter, this will be called the science of knowledge. The essence of the theoretical philosophy Fichte's lies in the effort to relate the determinations of the understanding to the absolute ego, the absolute I, because the ego opposes itself absolutely. None other than ego can give any doubtless knowledge. Fichte explains, therefore, how it is possible to deduce all the categories and the determinations from the activity of the absolute ego. In this relation, Fichte contrived many philosophical conceptions and methodologies which Hegel employed in the Phenomenology of Mind. From the sensual certainty to the perception, Hegel connects the result of sensual certainty in his phenomenology with the beginning of the perception through the notion of universal. Now he identifies universal with the substance. The object of the perception is a thing of many properties. Paragraph 112. A thing corresponds to the universal, whereas the property corresponds to the individual. Therefore, meaning of the universal in the perception is different from it in the sensual certainty. In the former, it is substance. In the latter, it is universal concept. As already mentioned, the perception in the phenomenology refer to the understanding of the relation of a thing and the many properties or substance and its attributes. The universal in the sensual certainty turns into the individual or the particular in the perception, because the universal substance includes quality or properties of matter like whiteness or sweetness. However, being is universal as a result of having mediation or the negative its own self. While it expresses this in its immediacy, it is differentiated, determinate property. Paragraph 113. This is the secret of the first paragraph part, paragraph 111 to 122 of the chapter Perception, because not only the substance but also the attribute is universal in Hegel's thought, even though the former is the intellectual universal, whereas the latter is the sensuous universal. By the way, being as universal by Hegel connects with the being as a thought by Parmenides. Thus, the universal in the sensation represents itself in concrete reality as a property, quality. The object of perception is a matter, a thing, or substance. The substance is commonly looked upon as a set of properties. It is also called the substrate, which is believed to underlie many properties. As above discussed, this notion of a substance was basically rejected by the English empiricism. Fichte also denied the traditional notion of a substance or substrate as the bearer of many properties. Hegel put first the universal notion of substance. A substance has many properties. For example, the salt is white, salty, and cubical. As might be expected, the definition of the substance or the thing includes in itself the difficulty. How can a substance as a self-subsisting include the manifold properties which are also self-subsisting, universal? In other words, property as well as the substance is universal. In this respect, the substance can be exchanged with the property. However, the many properties are in their determinateness themselves simply universal. Paragraph 113. Like other philosophers in his time, Hegel also reveals the problem of usual notion of a substance in diverse ways. In this regard, the mind of perception think of a thing as a thinghood, Dingheit in German, which emphasizes the common character of the thing. The thinghood is identical with the substrate. The thinghood as a common ground of plural property is expressed diversely like a simple togetherness, universal medium, continuity, pure essence, and the also. The peaceful coexistence of the many properties in the substance. The argumentation is as follows. The properties themselves are also the universals. For example, a property whiteness is universal in itself. Many white beings belong to the whiteness. We can think of the speak of whiteness. Therefore, the whiteness has its own self-identity, the relation to itself. The whiteness is said to be identical with the Platonic idea, eidos. Hegel described the thing or thinghood as the simple togetherness of the many. Moreover, each property is not supposed to be affected by the other properties. Many properties are said to be lie peacefully in a basket thinghood. They are indifferent to each other. The white does not affect or alter the cubic shape, neither of them affects or alters the tartness, etc. Rather, since each itself is a simple, relating itself to itself, it leaves the others at rest and relates itself to them only through the indifferent also. This also is therefore the pure universal itself, or the medium, the thinghood, keeping them together in that way. The here appearing phrase relating itself to itself means the self-identity. In the thing as a substratum, the self-identity of each individual property is preserved. The plural properties coexist peacefully in one and the same substance. This state of affairs refers to the common notion of the substantiality. Fidelity said thing and its properties. As might be expected, the state cannot last out, while many philosophers at that time pointed out the weakness of the substantiality. The order of properties, contrary to the hitherto peaceful coexistence of the many attributes in the thinghood, the indifferent manifold of the properties cannot endure the peaceful coexistence because each property is independent for itself or self-identical. The identity of a property excludes that of the other property. For example, whiteness is different from solidity. Whiteness opposed to solidity. They are excluded from each other. They don't have any common ground to share with. Therefore, they cannot belong to the same substance. Plural properties cannot be together at all. Furthermore, they are opposed to each other. The white property of salt is white so far as it excludes that the other properties, for example, the salty, the cubical, etc. From now on, Hegel follows the arguments and the conception of Fichte, while Hegel employs the conception of opposition and Gegensetzung in German to reveal the problematic of the substantiality. The thing as a simple togetherness of the many is not to be sustained. The previous alleged peaceful coexistence of the different properties of a thing turns out into war. The war of each self-identical independent property. The independent difference among the many properties amount to the excluding difference. Therefore, the different properties cannot be together in the same substance. In other words, they fall outside the thinghood. This suggests the destruction of the substance. The substance as a self-subsisting thing loses its ground. The self-certainty of the perception is collapsed. It turns out to be deception, even though the process of the perception is not yet totally over. Here the position of the perception represents merely that of the common sense. In this regard, Hegel reveals the weakness of the common sense as a lowly form of knowledge, like other philosophers do in his time. Their different properties could not be together in the same unity of their medium, which is as essential to them as is negation, insofar as their difference within that unity does not amount to an indifferent difference, but rather to an excluding difference, which itself amounts to a difference which negates others. So the difference does fall outside the simple medium. The result of dialectical movement of the perception is only negative, that is deception. It is therefore different from the movement of the sensual certainty, which brought about not only negative but also positive result, sublation in the meaning of denial, elevation, and preservation. Contrary to Hegel's sublation of reconciliation, Fichte's sublation connotes only negation, cancellation. In the chapter Perception, Hegel is inclined to negative dialectic of Fichte. The separation of subject and object as a new way of searching the universal. The structure of the chapter Perception is largely divided into 4 parts. First, perception is the search of the universal, the substance. Second, perception divided into the perceivable and the perceived, or pure apprehension and the pure one. Third, reflection into itself as a correction of the pure apprehension. Number 4, the problem of the being for itself and the being for others. Spinoza, substance and modification. The number 3 is also divided into 2 inwardly distinctive parts. Paragraph 118 to paragraph 120 and paragraph 121 to 122. The former is generally focused on Rousseau's thought about substantiality. The latter is evidently focused on Fichte's thought about substantiality. The latter half of the number 3 and the number 4 I will discuss in the second part of my YouTube article, Analysis of the Perception chapter in Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. In the second research of the substance and its property, the perception is divided into the perceiving and the perceived, that is subject and object. The perceiving subject is named Pure Apprehension, reines Auffassen in German, while the object is to be perceived is named Pure One or Pure University. This too is a kind of appearing knowledge, which this time goes through Rousseau's epistemology in the Creed of Savoyard, the priest, in his book Emile. Therefore, in order to understand the second stage of the perception, we should take note of Rousseau's role in the modern philosophy. Rousseau tried to combine the sensuous material with the mind through the active thinking ego. According to Rousseau, we can acquire the objective knowledge by virtue of the active thinking ego. The main function of the active thinking ego is to collect, compare, and judge the sensuous data. The active thinking ego by Rousseau is to be compared with the transcendental perception by Kant. On top of it, Fichte philosophy too owed Rousseau a lot. The function of mind is called the active ego or active I by Rousseau. I myself expanded the active ego into active thinking ego so as to emphasize the thinking function of the active ego by Rousseau. Rousseau bestowed the power of aggregation and the comparison on the active I. The impressions are given from outside, but the aggregation and the comprehension of them are made by myself, or the active thinking ego. This function are said to occur in me, not in things. The power of mind which brings my sensation together and compare them may be called by any name. It already be called attention, meditation, reflection, or what you will. It is still true that it is in me and not in things, but that it is I alone who produce it, though I only produce it when I receive an impression from things. Though I am compelled to feel or not to feel, I am free to examine more or less what I feel. Rousseau, the Creed of Savoyard, the priest in Emile, hereafter Creed. The function of the active thinking ego was above introduced to collect, compare, and judge the given sensuous material. Even if Rousseau came up with a revolutionary idea of active thinking ego or active I, and the synthesis of subject and object through it. He remained on the other side still at the state of realism or common sense. That is, he believed the thing in itself or outer reality separated from the subject. In this regard, Rousseau's revolution in philosophy was not complete. The remaining task from him was to be attributed to the German idealism. As from above inferred, Rousseau's theory of truth consists in the coexistence between subject and object on the basis of the realism. The truth is to see the reality as it is. The error comes into being because our false judgment about the reality. The sensation shows the existence of things rather than the understanding does. In this point, Rousseau believed in the sensation rather than the understanding as the active thinking ego. Even if I can examine and judge my activity of cognition, I know only that truth depends on the existence of things, not on my understanding, which is judge of them, and that the less such judgment depends on me, the nearer I am certain of approaching the truth. Hence, my rule of confiding more on sentiment than reason is confirmed by my reason itself. Rousseau Creed. Hegel represents the thought of Rousseau as below represented in his own way. The reception of the Rousseau is considered as the coincident theory or the theory of reflection with regard to the cognition. Now, this is the way that the thing of perception is constituted, and consciousness is determined as perceiving consciousness insofar as this thing is its object. It only has to take the object. It only has to conduct itself as a pure apprehension, and what thereby emerges for it is the true. Paragraph 116. The pure apprehension cannot always guarantee the truth that it takes in, because it can make mistake. This attitude of seeking knowledge is desirable in normal case, but problematic in the philosophy which seeks the ultimate truth. The pure apprehension has actually the possibility of falsity. The possibility takes place when the perceiver as the pure apprehension alters true by adding or omitting something. In other words, the characteristic of the second stage of perception lies in the thought that the failure of the searching the universal is ascribed to the subject, the perceiver, or me, in Hegel's text. Since the object is what is true, the untruth falls within me, and the apprehension was incorrect. Paragraph 117. If in this taking, if it itself were to do something, it would alter the truth by adding or omitting something, while the sub-object is true and the universal like unto itself, and while consciousness to itself is what is alterable and inessential. It can happen to consciousness that it apprehends the object incorrectly and deludes itself. Evident. The problem of pure apprehension is its belief that the substance or the universal is indifferent to me as the perceiving subject, like over-detailed surveyed. Therefore, the inability to grasp the universal is looked upon as due to my understanding or perceiving. That is, the object is considered as being true and unalterable. However, my understanding is considered as alterable and inessential. Therefore, my cognition is inclined to falsity, deception. I, as the perceiver, am responsible for the failure to grasp the true universal. Conclusively, this all is the cognitive attitude of the pure apprehension as an appearing knowledge. Chapter 7. Reflection into itself as the correction of the pure apprehension. The pure apprehension tries to posit the pure one as the universal substance. However, it failed to grasp it due to its rigid framework about cognition, as over fully explained. The pure apprehension is therefore to be cancelled or sublated. Therefore appears another type of appearing knowledge, that is the reflection into itself or the return into itself of the consciousness. This form of cognizance is not totally new. It is merely a correction of the pure apprehension as the passive acceptation of the objective truth. The new type of knowledge as a reflection into itself suggests actually no other than the active thinking ego, as over said. By virtue of the active thinking ego, we can collect, compare the given sensation and judge our cognizance. Without this function of the mind, there would be no communication of five each other different sensations. In this regard, the function of active thinking ego can be compared with the transcendental apperception by Immanuel Kant. If we were purely passive in the use of the one sense, our sense, there would be no communication between them. It would be impossible to know that the body we are touching and the thing we are looking at is the same. Creed. Hegel interprets Rousseau's statement in his way. The different from each other properties do not stem from the thing but from our different sense organs. Each sense organ of the human take up its corresponding property. We see the color with our eyes, etc. The problem of substance and the properties changes into a psychological problem of mind and body, that is, the relation of the passive sensation and the active intelligence. In this regard, the previous notion of the universal medium comes up again. However, this time we take up the role of universal medium. The thinghood, in other words, the active intelligence or the active thinking ego brings together many properties into a unity, substance. In this connection, we can come up with a synthetic unity of the manifold by Kant. The thing is therefore in fact only white as it is brought to our eyes. It is also tart on our tongue, and also cubical to our feel, etc. We do not take the entire diversity of these aspects from the thing, but from ourselves. To us, they come undone from each other in this way, because the eye is quite distinct from the tongue, and so on. We are thus the universal medium within which such moments dissociate themselves each from each other, and in which each is on its own. Paragraph 119. We know that the body we are touching and the thing we are looking at is same through the mind, Vidali said, active thinking ego, which Hegel described as we are thus the universal medium. Therefore, the long and the troublesome search of the universal substance seemed to end with success. Therefore, in truth, it is the thing itself which is white and also cubical, also tart, etc. Or the thing is also, which to say it is the universal medium in which the many properties stably exist externally to each other, and where none makes contact with the other, and none is sublated. Taken this way, the thing is taken to be true. Paragraph 120. In this way, the relationship of thing and its property is figured out successfully. The reason is that the concept of a thing or substance is not looked upon as objective but subjective, that is, as the act of active thinking ego. Hegel comprehends this act of subject as a reflection into itself, leaning on Fichte's philosophy. However, the way of information of reflection into itself, return into itself, is a lot complicated. First of all, the pure apprehension tries to grasp universal substance by way of dividing the subject, the perceivable, from the object, the perceived. However, it failed to do So, because it regards the perceiver as inessential, whereas the perceived as essential, the truth of the pure apprehension was looked upon as the pure one. Thereafter, the reflection into itself intervened in the pure apprehension to rectify the false paradigm of the truth by it. The universal substance should not be found in the object but in the subject. The pure one is nothing but I. We are the universal medium. Hegel represents usually the goal of cognition as the true. The consciousness which gave up grabbing the truth objectively returned into itself. Consciousness therefore necessarily learns through that cycle again, but not in the same way it did at first. It has learned from experience about the perceiving, namely that the result and its truth are its dissolution, or that perceiving is the reflective turn into itself from out of the true. Paragraph 118. The perceiving or perception realizes that its original truth results in its dissolution, deception. However, Hegel represented this thought in his own philosophical way. Perceiving is the reflective turn into itself from out of the true. Here appears the term reflection into itself or return into itself, in German, Reflexion in sich, for the first time. The concept of reflection is the most critical one of Fichte philosophy in its fundamental principle of a whole science of knowledge. Fichte's philosophical term reflection or reflection has at large two meanings. First, distinction. Second, return. The reflection as distinction is mainly the function of the human understanding. The reflection as return to itself consists in the internal activity of the absolute ego. According to Fichte, there are two kinds of cognitive activity: objective activity and the pure activity. The pure activity is, however, that which does not have at all any object, has a return into itself. Fichte, Science of Knowledge. Under the perspective of Fichtean idealism, Hegel began to use the term reflection into itself in the Phenomenology. In this regard, the reflection into itself or the reflective turn into itself means the negation of the objectivity or objective truth in Hegel's process of perception. Objectivity turned into subjectivity. For consciousness, it has thereby been determined just how it is perceiving is essentially composed, namely, it is not a simple pure apprehension, but rather in its apprehension has at the same time taken a reflective turn into itself from out of the true. The return of the consciousness into itself, which immediately intervenes in the pure apprehension, alters truth, for it has been shown to be essential to perceiving. Paragraph 118. An interesting point in Hegel's statement is the notion of the intervene or interfere, in German, Einmischen. Intervene or interfere is to Fichte's motive. As over revealed, the reflection into itself as a kind of appearing knowledge intervene in the pure apprehension and alters the truth of the latter, which was determined as a pure one, which referred to the universal substance. The reflection into itself intervenes in the pure apprehension and corrects the truth of it. Therefore, the truth of perception falls into consciousness. The truth of the perception is the synthetic unity of properties into the substance. However, through these cognitions, consciousness is capable of sublating the untruth. Consciousness differentiates its apprehension of the truth from the untruth of its perceiving. It corrects its perceiving, and insofar as it itself undertakes his correction, the truth of perceiving falls without further ado into consciousness. Evident. The truth of the reflection into itself, however, was already introduced in the foregoing. We are the universal medium. In short, Hegel found in Rousseau's Emile the opposite aspects about the possibility of human cognition and reconstructed them respectively as pure apprehension and reflection into itself, the theory of coexistence, and the active thinking ego. In the meantime, Hegel received and applied Fichte's notion of reflection into itself to reconstruct one of the contradictory to each other aspects of possibility of human knowledge by Rousseau. Intervention between the function of human cognition. By Fichte, the concept of the intervention has negative meaning. In this regard, the low stage of cognition intervenes in the high stage of it. The imagination intervenes in the understanding, which is actually a kind of falsity. The imagination, as having the feature of object, can scarcely refrain from intervening in the pure concept of the understanding, science of knowledge. On the contrary, Hegel used the concept of intervention positively. The high stage of the cognition intervene in the low stage of it. The reflection into itself as the high stage of appearing knowledge intervene in the pure apprehension as the low stage of it.